Hi, I'm Mark Sappenfield, the editor of the Christian Science Monitor. I'm here to welcome you to our event, Finding Resilience in Ukraine, which is part of our Community Connect series. And I wanted to start off by just letting everyone here know today that you can claim a distinction. You are a part of the largest Community Connect event we have ever done. We've had more registrants for this event than we have had for any other event. And if you think about it, it's not hard to understand why we're all here today. When you look at what's going on in Ukraine and you look at the pictures happening there, it's natural to kind of want to get a sense of, make sense of what's going on there. And Community Connect is about that. It's about creating a sense of community and connecting us all. And what do communities do in a time when things are difficult as we come together and we support each other? One thing I would say about what the Monitor brings to this specifically is we aren't just here to help you make sense of what's going on. When you look at what's going on in Ukraine, you have to ask yourself, how do I see what's going on there and not lose faith in humanity? And I think this goes to something deeper that the Monitor specifically brings to journalism. It's this question of how can I engage with news, and specifically news like this, and not feel like my spirit is broken by the event. There was an author who existed and wrote around the 1940s and 50s. He was from South Africa. His name was Alan Paton. He wrote a book called Cry the Beloved Country, which is a classic, well known in that country. And he was also a Monitor reader. And this is what he had to say about what the Monitor uniquely brings. He said, "I admire it most because it gives no shrift to any belief in the irredeemable wickedness of man, nor in the futility of human endeavor." An event like Ukraine severely tests that conviction. When you look around, you see destruction, you see violence, you see what might be termed wickedness. But is that all the story that there is? In many ways, I would say one of the most remarkable things about Ukraine is just the opposite, is that it has an amazing show of what human endeavor can do, both in Ukraine and beyond. So today what we'll be doing is we'll be talking to two reporters who have been to Ukraine for us just in the past few weeks since the invasion of Ukraine. And these reporters did things that reporters do. They went and they talked and they looked unflinchingly and talked about unflinchingly about the things that they saw in Ukraine. But they also did something else. They also consented to look through that wickedness to see the power of human endeavor, to see those sparks of light in the darkness, even a darkness that seems as dark as what we see going on in Ukraine. And we're here to talk about that today. So I want to invite who we have with us today. We have Martin Koos. Just going to raise your hand so everyone can see who you are. Martin Koos was in Ukraine for us when the invasion happened, and he can talk a little bit more about that. He also did reporting for us and for the military publication Stars and Stripes from Afghanistan. And so he has that experience to bring to this as well. We have Scott Peterson. Scott has been a war correspondent for 30 years. Scott can trace his time back to reporting out of Rwanda, the genocide there, out of Somalia, out of Afghanistan, out of Chechnya, out of Iraq. So he has a lot of experience in reporting in the situations that we're seeing right now. And then my co-host today, Amelia Newcomb, she is the managing editor of the Christian Science Monitor and was the former international editor of the Monitor and has been working very closely with our current international editor, Peter Ford, to plan our coverage and to make sure that these two men who joined us today were safe. So we're going to start this with a conversation among the four of us, just talking about a few things. But we also want to encourage you all to ask questions. A major part of this is going to be getting your questions and then answering those in real time. So the person who's going to be handling that part of the equation is Dave Scott, and he can tell you a little bit about how you can do that.
Hi, everybody. We would love to have you participate by sending in your questions for our panelists during the event. So to do that, you're going to click on the Q&A icon, which is the question and answer icon at the bottom of your Zoom screen, and then just type in your question. If you're on a PC or a tablet, you may have to move your cursor to make the icons pop up at the bottom of the screen. If you're on a smartphone, you may have to tap your screen to bring up the Q&A icon. Alternatively, if you're joining us via live stream, either on Facebook or YouTube, then you can drop your questions in the comments section below. And I'll be monitoring your questions and comments and be back in a few minutes to share those with our panelists. Thank you.
Thank you, Dave. We're excited about that part, but let's just go ahead and jump in and start to get to know these people and some of the amazing things they've done and how they've seen the work that they've done. So let's start, Martin, let's start with you. As I mentioned before in the introduction, you were actually there when it happened. We sent you into Ukraine before the invasion, and right up to the day before, you were doing kind of what you would consider, normal foreign correspondent work. You were actually going up fairly close to the border, interviewing people. And then obviously everything changed overnight, and you were a part of the news story. You were right there in Kyiv as it was happening. Why don't you just tell me a little bit about what that was like, going from one to the other, both as a journalist and just as a human being?
Right. Thanks very much, Mark, and thanks to everyone who has tuned in today. Very much appreciate that. So I went in on February 10th and headed straight to eastern Ukraine, to an area where Russian-backed separatists had occupied the southern reaches of the Luhansk and Donetsk regions, collectively known as the Donbas. And there's a 260-mile front line at that time, where I met with residents and soldiers in the trenches and talked to them about this ongoing so-called frozen conflict, a name that is both accurate and not. Accurate in the sense that life in the Donbas had, in fact, kind of frozen. You saw homes that had been destroyed, churches burned to the ground, and life disrupted. Villages cut off from each other, families cut off from each other, quite literally, no longer able to see each other because you had this front line where you had Ukrainian soldiers facing off against the Russian-backed separatists, and inaccurate in the sense that fighting still happened. Low-level fighting was still going on, and I witnessed some of that during my time down in the Donbas, where it was sort of like, if you've ever been to the symphony and you arrive early and you hear the orchestra sort of striking up its instruments. I would liken this to the terrible instruments of war. We're starting to warm up. There was more artillery fire, more rockets coming in. And both residents and soldiers were remarkably calm because they had heard this background music. As a newcomer myself, I picked up on the fact that it was getting increasingly intense. And having spent time in Afghanistan, I sort of understood this to be a kind of increase in these munitions being fired. But the residents who were conditioned to this were very calm, determined to go forward. I met a couple who lived in what they called the last house in Ukraine. This was a home where effectively Ukraine's border now ended at their property line, because just beyond their property was the front line for the Ukrainian soldiers who were facing off against those Russian-backed separatists. And they run. The wife is a nurse. Her name's Lilia. Vladimir is an ambulance driver. They tend to folks in that small village of about 1,500 people. And they just had this incredible strength of character, this determination to go forward, despite what they were, these really kind of these deprivations that they were experiencing. And that was also reflected in the soldiers that I met in the trenches. These were soldiers who were conditioned to living underground, living in what was like World War I trenches. And they were very accustomed to that and were not necessarily, I would say, they weren't posturing. They seemed very composed. They seemed ready for what might come. And even as that orchestra of music, terrible orchestra music started to pick up, they remained quite calm and composed. And then I left and went to Kyiv, and then things changed dramatically, virtually overnight. I'll pause there for the moment. We can talk more about Kyiv later. But that was a little bit what it was like in what had been the front line prior to Vladimir Putin launching his invasion.
Yeah, and I hope that we will have a chance, during the course of the event, to get back to that of what it was like to be there then. And then obviously you had to get out of the country yourself. So you all of a sudden were in a situation that many of the people you were reporting on were in at the same time. So I think we'll have opportunity to get back to that either in the questions from readers or in other ways. But I did want to pivot to Amelia, and you and I obviously work together in Boston, and so I'm oftentimes kind of right there, knowing what you're doing, right hand and left hand sort of thing. So I have some vision of what it takes to orchestrate, I guess to use another music metaphor, to orchestrate this kind of thing. But just maybe if you could talk a little bit about, what does it take to actually make sure that you're getting people in safely, you're getting the stories that you need to do, that how do people move around? What is it like behind the scenes to be an editor at this time?
Yeah, well, there's a lot going on, and I should start by saying that Scott and Martin both, like many of our other correspondents, are just amazing at figuring out who to be in touch with, where to go, how to be in touch with a wide network of other journalists and people who are acting in country to make sure that they're being as safe as they can. But it's everything. It's from insurance to what's your train, then the bus, how are you getting across the border, and all those kinds of things. And it's kind of interesting because, of course, we're sitting here, in my case in Boston, and they're the ones who are really on the front line of it all, having to figure it out. But Scott and I were just talking before this event about how this has been dubbed the WhatsApp war, because WhatsApp's been a huge help. So Martin was on one WhatsApp group with our international editor, Peter Ford, and a few others of us.
And for people who don't know what WhatsApp is, what is WhatsApp?
WhatsApp is it's like a messaging system, and it's secure, and it's a great way to communicate in real time without being easily tracked or anything. And so and you can have several people in the conversation. So, excuse me, if I ask something, then our international editor, Peter Ford in Paris, knows what I've asked Scott, and vice versa. And so it's really helpful. It also means that correspondents, when they're moving around, can actually send us a little marker of where they are. So if something were to happen, or if they were to go silent, we'd know where they had last been as best as possible. So that's a real help in potentially having to get assistance to them. But all sorts of things come up. In Martin's case, he went in, as you heard, and then all of a sudden the invasion happens and the ATMs are not available, or they're only allowing you to take out very limited cash. And so these are things you have to plan for or else work around. We also were concerned that communications might go down and you wouldn't have cell phone contact. So that set off a high energy search for what turned out to probably be one of the last satellite phones for sale in continental Europe. And that involved Peter Ford looking around, our correspondent in Germany looking around, getting on a train to find one in Hamburg, handing it off to somebody we met who could hand carry it into Ukraine, and making sure that Martin had what he needed to continue to be in Ukraine longer than expected and under more difficult circumstances. So
sounds almost like a spy film.
Yeah,
like
it's
scouring
really,
and taking things by hand across the border.
Yeah, and of course we're sitting here going, oh gosh, and so we can only imagine what it feels like for Martin, who's running out of money, and will the cell phone work or not? But it's one great thing about journalists in these situations is everybody helps everybody else, and they just really lean in and support each other. And fortunately, as Scott came into Ukraine, he was able to hand off extra cash to Martin and so forth and so on. So it's really quite a coordination effort, and of course it really ultimately depends on having really skilled people on the ground, which these two guys are. And that kind of leads me to a point for Scott. Scott and I have worked together for a long time, and I've seen him work in both Afghanistan and Iraq. But he's covered wars from Rwanda to Chechnya as well. And so, Scott, just wanted to ask you, now that you've been into Ukraine, what's different? You've been a war correspondent, as Mark said, for 30 years. How did this conflict strike you?
Well, Ukraine obviously is now it's been dominating, excuse me, it's been dominating all the headlines. But there were two things that really struck me about this conflict, which made it different from others. One is that, there was such an incredible and immediate outpouring of support for the Ukrainian side. And I can't remember a conflict where we just had such an immediate burst of support like that. Because even when, even, for example, I mean, you maybe argue that after 9/11 in Afghanistan, the United States had a huge amount of global support, which it did. That didn't last forever by any stretch. And in most of the other conflicts, like in Bosnia, for example, or Somalia, there would be like fluctuating degrees of interest, or they were too remote. Even Bosnia, took a very long time before, and this was always a comment that was made about Bosnia in kind of the early and mid 1990s, that it's right on the doorstep of Europe, but the Europeans aren't doing anything. The genocide in Rwanda took place in 1994, and the Clinton administration at the time basically took nearly 100 days, which was the span of that genocide, during which 800,000 people died, deliberately trying not to call it a genocide, because that would have meant that through international legal means, they would have been required to actually do something about it. But they'd just been burned by the Somalia fiasco, Black Hawk Down, and those scenes, and so they were unwilling to engage. So the fact that this conflict has yielded such an incredible outpouring, and this isn't just among Ukrainians, but I mean, these are people outside who are opening their doors, who are opening their wallets, and not just people with connections to Ukraine either, but I mean, people who have no connection whatsoever, who feel that an injustice has been done to the Ukrainians, and that also, they listen to and agree with the talking points that are made by President Volodymyr Zelenskyy, and when he says this is a fight that is not just for protecting Ukraine, but for all of Europe, and it's for all of us. He's cast it in that light, and I think a lot of the people who are supporting Ukrainians from outside are believing that. So that's one of the things that has been very, very different about this conflict, which was extraordinary. And I think that Ukrainians themselves, probably don't appreciate as much as they might. But the second thing is that, this conflict has yielded a degree of unity and spirit inside Ukraine that you truly have to see and witness to believe it. I mean, we hear reports from outside, and yes, of course, people are together, and everyone's on the same side. But it's not until you actually speak to people on the ground, hear Ukrainians, for example, who are native Russian speakers, who might, have in the past given or did give Russia the benefit of the doubt on all of their, general policies, and watching them describe to you how their thinking has changed because of what Russia has done to Ukraine at the moment. It's only then when you begin to realize that, like, every single person practically that you speak to has done something personal to play their role in this war. I mean, I know people who emptied their pocketbooks, ordinary people who literally would all of a sudden be trying to buy flak jackets for the military or for volunteer forces, people who would be putting their money into buying, I-beams that are normally used for construction work, so that those could be taken to a metal shop and, welded into anti-tank barriers. That is the kind of thing. And practically every sintal person I spoke to in Ukraine was trying to do something. And if all else failed, and if they didn't feel that there was anything else they could do, certainly in Odessa, where I spent most of my time, then they'd go down to the beach and fill sandbags, so that the defenses of that city were as solid as they could be. So those two things really, I think, struck me about this conflict, and I think are probably going to shape how it plays out.
So that brings to mind a couple of stories that you did, some from Odessa, but also from the city of Mykolaiv. And you've written really affectingly about people's humanity and hope and support for each other, and the really selfless and committed things people are doing. So how do you acknowledge that and, uplift that and bring it out in your stories, but at the same time not gloss over the real terror that surrounds their daily lives at this point when they're under attack? And another question we've been asked at times, it's sort of at a higher level of that, which is, how do you cover the fighting and people's courage and determination without making it somehow seem, glorified, or glorifying war on some level?
I think the framework of what we're reporting on is the fact that this is a war. The reason why we're there is because people on both sides are in kind of the most extreme circumstances that they've probably found in their entire lives. So finding stories of people's resilience in these circumstances are the reason why we're actually there. I mean, no one is glorifying war, and no one's glorifying either resistance or defense or any of those things. I mean, what I try and do as a correspondent in these places is try and find the voices of the people who are actually in these circumstances. How are they coping? How are they on a day-to-day basis? Because when we're outside and looking at headlines that, like, Mykolaiv was shelled overnight by artillery fire again, or Mariupol has been turned into rubble, those are things that in our minds we can you can lay them out. But until you actually hear the voices of people who are either in that bunker that night that got shelled or rocketed, or speak to the lady who was in her apartment when the rockets came through, or watched a family circling down the stairs of their apartment building during an air raid siren to go down and hide in the bunker yet again, and with no end in sight. Until you actually speak to those people, I don't think you have a real sense about the horrors of war, which hopefully is what comes through in this reporting, not any kind of a glorification of it, but also that human sense of what really matters to people in these circumstances, because they tell you. That's why we're there, to speak to them, to fill our notebooks with their voices, and to then pass those on in our stories.
Well, one thing that puts me in mind of is, Martin, as we mentioned, you've done a lot of reporting with the U.S. military, and specifically a lot of reporting about the U.S. military in Afghanistan and the fallout from that war. And in the course of that, you've done a lot of reporting on the idea of how do we help soldiers coming back from seeing, as Scott was saying, the horrors of wars. And this is a different circumstance in the sense that certainly, the Ukrainian military lifted it, but you've got an entire population that is in the middle of it. I mean, what did you take from the reporting that you did that kind of says, how do we help people process this to find that resilience like Scott's talking about?
I think the kind of global outpouring that Scott alluded to earlier is part of that. On the ground, though, it's this also what Scott was talking about, the remarkable unity and solidarity among the Ukrainian people, banding together to help their own in their darkest hour. And when you think about trauma and how it's being inflicted on an entire country and entire people, you have to think about it generationally. When I was in Lviv, in the western part of the country, just sort of the last big city before you get to the border with Poland, I met a family, 3 generations: grandmother, her adult daughters, and the daughter's 2 young sons. And the men of the family were back home in Kharkiv in eastern Ukraine, a place that has been reduced to ashes and memory by Russian shelling. And under the declaration of martial law that President Zelenskyy put in place, men between the ages of 18 and 60 are required to stay home. So the women are there in Lviv at a refugee center. And the grandmother was in tears and kept asking, why is this happening? Why is this happening? Why is Russia doing this to us? Now, keep in mind, and these are people who grew up speaking Russian, attending Russian Orthodox churches, harboring no ill will toward the Russian people, but questioning the decisions of its government. And I think what I saw when I spoke to them is this idea of, like, here's the grandmother, she's obviously concerned about her adult daughters, and then there are these children. And so you have this cascading effect of trauma. How are these children who are having their country effectively taken away from them going to react going forward? And how are they, and how is, as a mother or a grandmother, how do you help them sort of understand these traumatic events, this upheaval that suddenly has taken over their lives? And I'll just quickly add that, having spent time in Afghanistan, very much the same there. You basically had a country that's faced war since 1979, since the Soviet Union invaded. So there's a little bit of a common denominator there. And I spoke to a doctor I know recently, Dr. Habib, if you're on the call, salam alaikum. And he was mentioning 4 generations of his family have now experienced war. And I think that the way to cope with that, and the way you try, I think, in our coverage to show that there is some light, there is a way forward, is to try to illuminate the remarkable strength of character in the Ukrainian people, and to show how, really to a person, they have responded to this moment and joined together, as Scott was saying, whether it's picking up arms or simply picking up each other. And I mean that quite literally. At this train station in Kyiv and Lviv, I watched younger people carrying the elderly and disabled people up and down the stairs to platforms. That is devotion to one another. And I think that if Ukraine has a chance to surmount this trauma, it is that strength of character and a strength they have found with each other.
That's beautiful, Martin. Thank you. At that point, I would say, let's go to questions from you all. So Dave, maybe I'll throw it over to you. I don't know if we're getting questions in, if we need to get more, but it would be great to hear from you all out there on what you'd like us to talk about.
Yeah, Mark, thank you. We've got lots of questions coming in, so no worries
Good.
there. But if you'd like to send your question in, remember, just click the Q&A button at the bottom, the icon at the bottom of the Zoom screen, and type your questions. So here's the first question. Seeing several stories about propaganda, about the Russian perspective on this, I'm just going to read one of these. I'm not seeing the side of the story that points out that there may well be loyal Ukrainians who welcome the Russian presence. The official Ukrainian government has a great degree of professional expertise when it comes to creating theater and illusions. I'll toss that to you guys and see where you go with that one.
Perhaps I'll let Martin speak about what he found in the Donbass first, which is where the Russians have been most powerful, and then I can pick up after that in Odessa, which is Russian speaking, but not particularly pro-Russian right now.
Right, and I don't think I'm tipping anything here. I think Scott's experience was the same. In the Donbass, it's a primarily Russian-speaking region. And again, the cultural traditions, the religious rituals are primarily Russian. And there isn't this strong outpouring of hatred toward the Russian people. It's a question of why has the Russian government done this? And nobody that I met, and I'm talking about 3-4 dozen people, expressed a desire to cross over into Russia. Now that's empirical. I didn't do a broad-based survey, but we're talking in the neighborhood of 40 to 50 people. And I think there's integrity in that response in the sense that they're not expressing a blanket loathing of Russian people. They make the distinction. They see the information warfare that Russia has attempted to propagate. And I think that they are on the receiving end of the actual war. That is going to be quite persuasive when you're facing artillery fire and gunfire. And that I did not encounter, and I think Scott's experience was similar, but I did not encounter anyone who was expressing a desire to go across. And in fact, I met residents who are in the area of Luhansk and Donetsk that are occupied by Russian separatists. And they describe a life of something like purgatory. They still live in those places because they have homes, but they feel entirely isolated, entirely cut off. And they wonder when might they become whole again with all of Ukraine.
So the first story, I mean, and my experience, but with a different framework in Odessa is very, very similar, because the first story that I went there to report on was what does a city that in the past has been considered to be one of the most pro-Russian in all of Ukraine, what are they thinking about this Russian invasion? And what I've found, and of course the majority of people I spoke to, the dozens and dozens of people I spoke to over the course of 2 weeks, were native Russian speakers, and I found a lot of them who were literally in the process of changing their minds. I mean, if they had pro-Russian sympathies before, and they told me this very explicitly, they said, I used to be, thinking, very highly of Russia, but now I don't anymore. I'm actually much more Ukrainian. I spoke to people who said that they would be, that they were beginning to speak more Ukrainian instead of Russian, even though they were native Russian speakers, and saying that, and people, some of the people I spoke to actually insisted that I use a Ukrainian spelling of their name, even though they would have grown up with using a Russian spelling of their name. That would have been what their parents, how they would have spelled their name, and this is how they insisted it be translated or transcribed into English. So people really were not in favor of Russia. People repeatedly were like, the last thing we want. We see what the Russians have done in Crimea. We see what the Russians have done in the Donbass. We see what the rest of Russia looks like outside of Moscow and St. Petersburg. And that kind of poverty, that kind of system that they're living under is not what we want for us. And they said, and that was it. And I heard this repeatedly and often even unprompted. But the first story that I looked at was, this place. And whenever I mentioned that to people, because that would often be the initial starting point, it'd be like, Odessa does have this reputation of being more pro-Russian. And literally the Odessans, who were the Russian native speakers, would laugh that off and then just say, no, that was a long time ago. I mean, that mask began to slip, they would say, back in 2014 when Russia first took over Crimea and intervened in eastern Ukraine and also in the broader political system, and that hasn't changed. And so, that is what we hear reporting on the ground, speaking to people, and that's the kind of thing that unless you're actually there, it's very easy to say, oh, well, that can't possibly be true. Well, I mean, I don't know. I didn't do a broad survey of every single person in Odessa, but I sure spoke to a broad spectrum. And some of the young people we spoke to did say, oh, yes, well, my grandparents actually are really still pro-Russian and all they watch are the Russian television channels and things like that. But the very distinct impression that I got was that was a very small minority, and that those arguments that would have come from those people would have just not measured up at all to the experience that Ukrainians there were feeling.
One important bit of context, if I could just throw this in, is that, Scott, you were also our Moscow correspondent. I don't remember for how long, but I mean, you have clearly seen this also from a Russian perspective and don't come at it with an anti-Russian perspective at all. So I just think that's an important thing to add.
Sure. Yeah, I was based in Moscow for 5 years. The first trip I made to Ukraine, I went to Chernobyl, and that was 20 years ago. Since then, I've been back a couple of times during the actual war in 2014. And I mean, Russia's an amazing, an extraordinary, an exceptional country. And what you hear from Russians now, and Russians who I know, is a degree of, for those who are paying attention, and Russians do pay attention. I mean, they use VPNs, which allow them to get news beyond the state television channels and that sort of thing. They know what's going on. They aren't cheap. And as our Moscow correspondent has also made clear in the past, that, Russians have, after all their decades of experience with the Soviet Union, are very familiar with how propaganda works and how these things are put together. And what I heard from Ukrainians who would try and communicate with their Russian relatives and found that they couldn't actually communicate because they were like, oh, by the ones in Russia would be like, oh, watch out, there are Nazis all around you, and and all that kind of stuff. And they said, don't you, and the Ukrainians would say, don't you know we're being shelled here? And they had no idea. They'd be like, oh, you're being liberated. And people would just stop speaking to their Russian, to their Russian relatives. But we do know though that for many Russians, of course, they're ashamed at what their government is doing in Ukraine, and and many people know it.
I've got lots more questions here, so let me just jump in and pick up on the Russian theme here. I've got a question from Charlotte, who said that she's grateful for your approach. She's seen a number of recent articles that show that some of the higher ups in the Kremlin are starting to speak out or leave. Do you see this as significant? And we've also had a few questions about whether there might be a coup against Putin. Scott, I don't know if you feel like you can speak to that, or anybody else on the panel feels like they could speak to that.
There have been a number of intriguing reports. Early on, we had reports that two of the top FSB chiefs, this is the successor organization of the KGB, these would have been the people who in theory were responsible for giving reports to Vladimir Putin about kind of the state of play in Ukraine, how welcoming Ukrainians might have been to this invasion. They were apparently put under house arrest. The Minister of Defense, who's very well known because for many years he was also the Minister of Emergency Situations. This is such a great title. Shoigu. So he disappeared for 2 weeks and appeared today. In fact, and and people are speculating, and of course the Kremlin said, well, he's actually really got a lot on his plate. He's too busy to be doing media things. Sure enough, but people of course start speculating about what's happening, and the Russians themselves also separately have lost almost half a dozen, if not more, generals so far among their casualties, which is extraordinary. I mean, you know, generals don't usually kind of lead from the front. They did during the Iran-Iraq War. The Iranians lost a defense minister, you know, once, and but the, you know, and of course lost actually some of their own generals in Syria more recently. But I mean, the United States didn't lose a single general in either Afghanistan or Iraq during a combined 35 years of conflict. So, because generals don't normally go right to the front, but they are doing so in Russia. So, of course, that's yielding a lot of speculation about the state of play, how ready, how able, you know, these forces are. And those reports coming from the Kremlin, again, also another report today is that one of President Putin's, you know, top advisors has now appeared in Turkey. I think it was Turkey. And, but in any event, like left and basically said, I don't want to have anything to do with this. That was the reason. So, I mean, you know, it's hard to say what it all adds up to, but, you know, it's not looking particularly positive. Yield a coup. I mean, I think, you know, President Putin's had a lot of time to kind of coup-proof things, but we say that, and, you know, it's not possible until it's possible.
Martin, you were in Lviv and you saw a lot of the refugees coming out. We do have several questions here. People concerned about people getting out even now. Can they still get out? How are they getting out? Can you maybe talk to the humanitarian situation?
Sure. Basically, getting out by any means possible. Primarily rail, bus, and car, but people on foot as well. And it's an ebb and flow of refugees moving through Lviv and onward to Poland, Romania, Slovakia, excuse me. And you have the city of Lviv is about 720,000 people. Its population has effectively grown by 30% on any given day. Now you have 200,000 refugees who are housed at centers within the city. Most of them move on, but then more come in. And so it's this kind of inflow and outflow. And I think at this point, the exodus is becoming smoother, if you will. A lot of the initial obstacles have been worked out, but it comes with this great uncertainty. One never knows when there might be a strike on the railway system, for instance. Lviv, in just the last week, 10 days, has had a couple of missile attacks. One within the city at the closed airport, another one about 30 miles away at a military training site. And so the situation is always fraught for refugees. They're abandoning everything that they have known: families, homes, the order of life. They move forward with a suitcase or two, these kind of fragments of these abandoned lives, and they hurtle toward the unknown. They may know someone in Poland or Romania, Slovakia, but beyond that, it's hard for them to understand what happens next. You've had a tremendous outpouring from governments and relief organizations who are in Poland, Romania, Slovakia, attempting to help refugees sort of find their way forward. I think the good news, if it can be called that, is that they are able to get out. But of course, that really is only the first or second stage. Beyond that, now they face these questions for which most of them have no answers.
You know, Martin, you saw that particularly up close and personal when you took the train from Kyiv to Lviv. You were getting out of the city, the capital, with, you know, thousands upon thousands of others. And I think it was like a 10-hour train ride. I wonder if you could share a little bit about that experience, because you were seeing particularly a lot of mothers with children in the train cars with you, fleeing.
Right. It was, the invasion began, and 24 hours earlier, Kyiv more or less resembled its normal self. City of 4 million people, people out walking their dogs, going to the park, kids playing at playgrounds. And then it was as if someone had flipped a switch and the city emptied out, cars clearing out of the city, people just rushing to the main railway station, which I was staying near there. So I went there on the first day of the invasion, and it was just these heart-wrenching scenes of people trying to get on trains and trying to find a way out, because at that point, nobody knew just how quickly the Russians might move into Kyiv, because they could hear the sounds, and none of it was encouraging. Nobody knew if there were going to be airstrikes or cruise missiles. So eventually, I had made the decision that amid that uncertainty, that it would be best if I tried to get to Lviv. And it was, I think Scott can speak to this as well, but there's this, you feel a kind of ethical dilemma, because of course you're thinking of your own safety, but you're surrounded by people who are facing much more dire circumstances. And I never felt comfortable trying to thrust myself in and trying to basically take a seat, take a spot on that train that might be a mother or a grandmother or a child. In my case, I eventually was able to get onto a train after everyone had either been had boarded or had been sent away, and I simply inquired if I could get onto a train, and this conductor was kind enough to let me on. And I'll say quickly that the conductors showed great humanity. That too is part of the resilience of the Ukrainians and the strength that they showed. The conductors were not baton-wielding thugs trying to send people away. If they could have taken everyone in a single train, they would have done it. I saw conductors breaking down because they couldn't allow more people on board. And then, it was the slow train ride to the west, and there was this sense of great relief, but also a sense of mourning. Many women on board just had this look of numbness, and you heard people crying, but what I remember most was the silence of people wondering, what now? What has happened to us? And what I then heard, for instance, at the refugee centers of why is this happening to us? I think it was unspoken on that train, but it was the sense that I had. And I did speak to one young woman who was just utterly bewildered. I mean, she was under the circumstances quite vivacious, and I was struck by her ability to sort of process what was happening. But she just said, I don't know what happens next. I don't know, if I'll ever come back to Ukraine. I mean, imagine being 22 years old and facing that circumstance. Imagine being 72 years old and having lived in a country your entire life and leaving it and not knowing if you'll ever set foot in it again. So those moments were, of course, you see them as a reporter, but on a personal level, those things really cut deeply.
Thank you, Martin. There are a number of questions, too, about the path to peace, if there is one. Here's a specific question from Margaret Lewis. Would negotiating for Russian access to the port of Mariupol lead to any peace? And there are more general questions. That's a specific proposal, but the idea that maybe giving that southern port to the Russians is enough to save face or to move on in a peace deal? Or are there other paths to peace that might be a negotiated settlement? And I'd say anybody on the panel can jump in on that one.
I think that's a great question. I don't think that giving Mariupol, which now, as President Zelenskyy said, no longer exists as a city anymore because of the hammering it's had over the last 3 weeks. I don't think giving that port to the Russians is going to make much difference, because they already have the entire Crimea. There are, their Black Sea fleet is already, properly housed. And so the port isn't kind of the top priority. I mean, what they would like to be able to claim is if they capture Mariupol and then capture the, basically form a land bridge that goes from the Crimea to the Donbass, which is the areas, where the pro-Russian separatists are in control. That would be one piece of it. The thing is that it really does seem clear that President Putin has a much broader agenda. I don't think at this point he would be satisfied with that little extra piece of land, considering what he's, how much kind of firepower, manpower, military hardware, and everything else that he's applied to this. I mean, we have been looking at, in a very large country, a three-prong, three different direction assault on this country. Now, military strategists will say that was far too many troops to try and take Kiev. I mean, they had far too many objectives. And of course, they didn't account for the fact that, kind of years of corruption and hollowing out, the Russian forces would mean that overextended supply lines and, kind of logistical problems, never mind low morale issues and all the things that have been reported would kind of dog the Russians. But even if everything had gone right, I mean, there was a calculation, it appeared, that the Russians were going to, take Kiev in just a matter of days, and that the whole country would fall. They probably, President Putin is probably looking at how the Taliban, swept through Afghanistan in a matter of weeks and days and thought, well, gee, this might just be possible. I mean, we don't know what he was really thinking, but what I would expect is that his ambitions are far, far greater than just taking that one piece. Now, which leads us to what is going to lead to peace. I mean, it's been interesting that in these kind of, episodes of peace talks that have been going on, the Ukrainians and the Russians both, just in the last few days, have said that there have been some optimistic sounds going. But when you actually look at what has been proposed, reports have come out of Turkey and elsewhere about kind of what the Russians put on the table. And it includes things like the denazification of Ukraine and all that, which I suppose the Ukrainians could accept because this doesn't mean anything to them. They're like, who are these Nazis that are supposedly under the control of the Jewish president of Ukraine? So that, the whole Russian story doesn't add up that way. But it also includes, the Russian proposals also include some quite significant changes, for example, to Ukraine's constitution, which would basically prevent it from, joining NATO or doing, or even being having the kind of support from the West that Ukraine currently enjoys. Now, of course, the Ukrainians do not want to be seen to be acceding to, kind of basically military blackmail. That's how they see it. And so I think that I think we've got a long way to go before we actually get to a point, because I think what's probably going to make all the difference is what we see on the battlefield in the coming weeks. I mean, just in the last 2 days, we've begun to see Ukrainians push back for the first time on two separate fronts. They began to capture, apparently recaptured parts of Irpin in the north near Kiev, and also to the southeast in Kherson. They're pushing out of Mykolaiv and also making progress there. Now, how long will that continue? Who knows? The Russians have, on paper, far more forces. They certainly have more firepower, and that firepower can be brought to bear from a very far distance. So, the Russians have that option always. So I think it's not actually clear, because I think until we actually get a shift in thinking in the Kremlin, then I think that they're going to be continuing to push up against quite strong resistance from the Ukrainian side. And it's too hard to, I would not put a timeline on on when things are going to be changing.
Thanks, Scott. And we've got a number of questions too about the safety of monitored journalists in a war zone. Maybe Amelia, you could start by talking about the editor's role in that, and then maybe hand it to, what does Scott do to, or Martin do to stay safe?
Lots of exhortations to please be careful. We talk through before correspondents get on the road. Do you have enough money? Do you have proper safety equipment? Do you have safety equipment for the people on the ground who are going to be assisting you in getting around? We call them fixers. In this case, do you have a flak jacket? Obviously, with the invasion, all of a sudden there was a run on protective equipment in Europe that made all of these suddenly become quite significant challenges. Can you make sure you check in, as I mentioned earlier on I'm here, it's 9 o'clock, now I'm moving to this place, now I'm moving to that place, which may seem like, well, what can I do about that from Boston? But as I said, if people go silent, then at least you know where you last could try to locate them. And there are a lot of things like that. Are you working with other people? Are you in touch with networks and so forth? So we do our bit. But really, in this case, it's Martin and Scott using their well-honed skills. I will say we do not send new people into conflict zones unless they're with a trusted and experienced correspondent. And so that's a big factor. But, Scott and Martin, maybe you could speak to some of the things you do to make sure that you've got your eyes, on, 360 view as best you can when you're traveling and moving about.
I think it's a matter of being candid with yourself about the circumstances that you're facing. You know, you assess as best as you can before you go in, with the full awareness that the assessment goes out the window, or can go out the window very quickly, as it did in this case. And I'd say this, and I don't mean it glibly because it's actually true, but it sounds a little bit glib. I say, you can't file when you're dead. And knowing where your own limit is as a reporter, as a person, as to what you're willing to risk to get the story and how important you think that story is to be told. We've seen incredible acts of heroism by journalists in this war. The AP photographer who spent 20 days in Mariupol to tell the world of the horrors that have been visited upon that poor city and those people. That is because he stayed there. He stayed there, and he felt it was important to broadcast that to the world. And each journalist makes that determination on his or her own. And really, in the moment, you have to be aware of your surroundings, of course, and hopefully you have trust in the people with whom you're with. But you also check yourself. You have to know your boundaries, and I think that's, for me anyway, that is key to trying to remain safe while in a combat zone.
Yeah, and I might just toss in there that we try to really make it clear, I hope we do, that no story is worth, getting captured, getting killed, getting seriously harmed. And so we really do trust our correspondents to say, I can't go there, or it's time to come out, or that's not the right thing to do. But, Scott, you have a particular lens literally on this, because not only does Scott write for us, but he photographs as well. He's a highly skilled photographer, and you saw some of his photos on the video that you saw at the beginning of the program. And that puts you in a different position. So maybe you could speak to that as a piece of staying safe.
Well, first, just on exactly what Martin said, I think what is crucial in those situations, just regarding trying to keep safe, I think the most important tool that you have to keep you safe is what is between your ears. I mean, what you are thinking, how you are assessing, how mentally prepared you are for what is clearly going to be a sizable, you're going to be witnessing perhaps a lot of suffering, and you need to also you need to be able to get there, understand that suffering, or whatever it is that you need to be amidst it, and then be able to get back and be able to tell the story. And that is absolutely crucial. So the calculation always is to obviously make sure you get done at the end of the day and are intact and are able to get out. And that's crucial. And I would give a nod to everybody, all of our colleagues who are now in Kiev, who are in Kharkiv, who are in, on their way to Kherson, who are Mykolaiv, who are in Mariupol. Those two AP guys, incredibly impressive. To be doing that. So, but people do it, and it's therefore possible. And knowing how to do it and learning how to do it is usually a function of experience. It takes time, and but it's but a lot of these, it's possible. And a lot of the people, for me, I'm seeing my colleagues and veterans from the Bosnian War, from the African wars, of course. Iraq and Afghanistan is on everybody's has been on everyone's resume all these years, but lots of other stuff besides. So the people who are there now are really, for the most part, those are, a lot of them doing the best work are really veterans of this type of conflict. Amelia, to your question about the lens, I've always felt that not just a picture is worth 1,000 words. Sometimes it can be worth 10,000 words. There's some things that you cannot describe in text. And I've written 2 books. I've written, I don't know how many hundreds, perhaps thousands of stories for the Monitor, but there's some things that can be achieved with the right click of your camera and the glass that's in that lens. And sometimes those things blend together beautifully. They help to tell a story. I think for readers to be able to have a visual map sometimes of what you're describing, so that they can see themselves, the color, the emotions on people's faces, the humanity that's there, the calm, the calm confidence that people have when they say, we're going to win and this is why. And it's one thing to say that and to quote them saying it, and it is another to witness them through the camera demonstrating that. That sense, it was extraordinary. I think one of the, I posted a video on Instagram, for example, from the moment that I arrived at this sandbag, where people in Odessa were down at the Odessa Yacht Club, basically digging up the Black Sea sand and putting it into sandbags. There was music going on and everything else. And, all of these people were relishing the fact that, one, they were doing something that was very useful for, Odessa's civil defense, because those sandbags are now everywhere, throughout the city, protecting everything from statues to government buildings to, just all kinds of things. But also, they got the sense themselves that they weren't alone, that we're all going to see through this, everyone's working hard to do it, but most importantly, we are together, we're not alone. So many times people, Ukrainians would tell me, well, if I just go home or sat in my apartment, I'd be so alone. I would feel that we were losing. But if we come out and do this kind of community effort, it's so clear to me that there's no chance we can lose, because look at all the spirit that's been going into the actions that we're taking. So anyway, being able to demonstrate that with a camera is, I think, critical to storytelling.
Good,
and I just want to add quickly that also the work of Ukrainian journalists in this war has been extraordinary. Time and again, they have been the first ones on the ground, shooting those videos, shooting those photos, telling us the stories. And then the Western journalists will often pick up on that work. They have shown remarkable strength and bravery in these horrific circumstances. So just want to make sure that we mention them as well.
Absolutely, here.
Yeah.
Just want to zoom out a little bit from what we've just been talking about to a number of questions about this threat of a nuclear war. How do we keep from being held hostage to Putin's threat to use nuclear weapons if he's feeling threatened? And how do we prevent this from becoming World War III? It's a big question. Anybody in the panel want to try to address that?
So, well, I will, because I actually spoke to a woman who calmed herself by thinking that there's no way that President Putin can press the button on his own. And she thought the fact that there was this kind of structure in place, and I'm not sure how, kind of wide that structure is, or how many people have to give the say-so before a nuclear weapon is used in Russia, but by Russia. But she calmed herself from the worst case scenario by just thinking that there's no way that one person alone is going to be able to make that decision and actually carry it off. I think there's so much speculation involved in this, and it's hard, it's hard to imagine, an old Cold Warrior like Vladimir Putin making a decision to kind of go nuclear, even with tactical nuclear weapons. But then again, I don't think you'd rule anything out, in the sense that, many people would argue that this entire move toward Ukraine and the way that it was conducted has been irrational and doesn't make sense, and is going to just yield nothing but suffering, and is lose-lose for President Putin, no matter how you add it up. So, could he lash out? This is a very, very valid question, and people wouldn't rule anything out.
We've had a number of questions about sort of the tactical military side of things, but there's one that sort of stuck out here, which was about the Ukrainians seem to have been able to at least control some of the airspace, and they were just wondering, do you see Ukrainian jets in the sky? Do you see dogfights overhead? What does it look like from the ground there?
Well, in Odessa, we had, and in Mykolaiv, we heard planes from time to time, but they're not, any dogfights that were going on, I don't think that's how one would establish, air superiority. I think what we see is a very large Air Force on the Russian side, which has been also underutilized, according to, military analysts. But the Ukrainians have been increasingly effective at bringing down planes and helicopters, which, using kind of man pads and these handheld rockets, and more of those by the thousands are now going into into Ukraine, which is making it all the more lethal for Russian pilots. So my understanding is that the Russians are having a hard time replacing pilots that have been lost. And the Ukrainians themselves, while they have also a good Air Force, and I'm not sure that it's so large, but what they're trying to do is to basically prevent the Russians from using their ordnance by going after them with these missiles. And they've been very effective. By their count, they've knocked out several hundred Russian planes already.
And I think that this is something that perhaps Vladimir Putin miscalculated on. When he invaded in 2014 in the Donbass, he encountered a Ukrainian military that I think universally described as sort of decrepit and sort of basically falling apart, underfunded. And having met veterans of that war who are now deployed again on the front lines and the Donbass, it was clear what 8 years had done to the Ukrainian military. That's a function of Western aid and advisors working with the Ukrainian military, but it's also the professionalization, if you will, of the Ukrainian military. And in that 8 years, they became a fighting force that I don't think Putin reckoned he would encounter. I think the not just the strength of the resistance, but the effectiveness of the resistance. It's a well-trained military at this point. And so in reflecting on some of those soldiers that I met really before the invasion began and the assuredness with which they spoke about how they would respond if Russia did in fact invade has really been borne out by I think what we've seen. And again, it's early, we're a month into this war. Russia practically invented the war of attrition so they can keep throwing bodies at the Ukrainian forces. But up to this point, on the ground and in the air, we have seen a Ukrainian military that has given Russia far more than I think its generals or Putin bargained for.
We've got a number of comments and questions about how our readers and watchers can help, what they can do to help. And we will have a slide at the end of this show with links where you can possibly donate or support. But also there's questions about, so if people are trying to help, is that aid actually getting in and reaching people in Ukraine? What do the supply lines look like from your experience? Is it getting there? Are there ways in and out?
What I saw in Lviv, it is getting in. And people have asked me for advice on which organizations to try to support. We have organizations on both sides of the border. We have some that have set up on the Polish side and are providing, like I think AmeriCares is one organization, that providing care to refugees just as soon as they come over the border. You also have a lot of supplies coming in overland via Poland, working its way into Lviv, and then from there spreading out across the country. Of course, as Scott well knows, I think if you move down to Odessa and some of the cities near there, whether or not the supplies can actually reach people is an entirely different question. If they're in Mariupol or Kharkiv, very, very difficult to actually get the supplies there. But at least if we're thinking about the refugees who are moving west and coming through Lviv, for instance, there are a sort of constellation of aid organizations that are providing both things like medical care, so all sorts of supportive services, as well as providing a great degree of guidance to refugees to try to figure out where they go next.
All right, I'm going to hand it off then to Mark, and we'll finish up here. Thank you, everybody. There were dozens and dozens of questions. I apologize that we weren't able to get to all of them, but thank you for your participation.
And we will, this is just me jumping in before we just have one last question. There are a couple of kind of public service announcements that I need to make just along the lines that Dave was mentioning about things that we can offer you after this is over. So before we get to that last question, I just want to make sure that you don't forget that our coverage on resilience in Ukraine is at csmonitor.com/Ukraine. And on that same page, you can find our free newsletters or become a Monitor subscriber or follow us any way you'd like. If you're looking, this is again what Dave was talking about, if you're looking specifically about ways that you can help the people of Ukraine, I think we can show a slide that shows 3 organizations that you might be interested in to provide support. And we can also read more. You can also read more about how you can help at csmonitor.com/help Ukraine. And we'll also include this information in the chat after the event. So speaking of that, immediately after the webinar, there will be an opportunity for all our Zoom participants to discuss this topic with your fellow attendees. What are your reactions to writers' examples of resilience in Ukraine in the face of so much adversity? Have you seen similar instances of resilience providing hope in your community? What advice would you provide for people in your community to foster resilience? All of these things. It will be an opportunity for us to chat about these and discuss them further. And that chat will be moderated, and we'll outline the ground rules for that chat. We'll outline the ground rules in the chat window after this call. Also, later today, we are going to be sending out a very short survey, and that's really important to us because we just want to know how we can make these better, how we can make these more meaningful to everyone. So we do hope that you will be looking for that and that you will fill it out, because that just will help us make the next one better. So why don't we go ahead and go back to one final question from Dave.
Sure. So we've had a number of questions along these lines too. I'm just going to read one of them. Why is the response to this war from the developed world different to the response of wars and refugee crises of less developed nations with predominantly brown and black people? And I know that we've written about that at the Monitor somewhat, but maybe one of you can take that question.
Sure. I think that, I think the circumstances have been particular to what's gone on in Ukraine. That's one reason. I think definitely also, and I think a lot of people have felt this, and that's one reason why we've written about it and explored this a bit, was that, the reactions, for example, of Poland and other European countries to the number of people, so many people that have crossed out of Ukraine, whereas, several years ago when there were so many Afghans, Syrians and others that were trying to cross those same borders, they were basically like prevented from coming. There were limits on numbers. There was what was called a crisis at that time. There's a crisis now, but it's not seen as a crisis. It's seen more as, kind of helping your brothers in Ukraine. A couple things to think about. One, and definitely there are disparities, and there's no doubt about that. But one of the reasons why there are these disparities is because Ukrainians and Poles, just to give one example, have a lot of connections and have always had connections and have done so for centuries. So for them, this is almost like, helping family members. This is in many respects actually is helping, fellow family members. So it's not just, whereas there are not too many Poles who have relations in Syria or in Afghanistan or elsewhere. Another aspect is the fact that this has been such, the circumstances of the Russian invasion, how it happened, how it has affected Ukrainians, and also going back to what Amelia mentioned very, very early on, that this is kind of a WhatsApp war. Everybody has known in real time everything that's gone on here. You couldn't possibly there are not enough hours in the day to keep up with all the social media posts from all of these different cities about what's going on. And 98% of them, despite whatever, propaganda efforts are being conducted on both sides, and the Russians especially have been putting forward some very impressive storylines. Despite all that, people see incredible amounts of destruction, vast civilian populations that have been suffering because of that shelling. And they hear Ukrainians saying, why are our Slavic brothers in Russia doing this to us? So all of those things have meant people have felt a surge of support for injustice. And it's not because these are, white Ukrainians. It's not because they're Christian Ukrainians, although that will factor into some people's thinking, but it's because the actual sense of injustice has been so abrupt and so immediate. Whereas in a lot of these other circumstances, the Afghanistan war, as Martin mentioned, this has been going back, since the mid-70s, in fact. So there have been refugees coming from Afghanistan for all those years. The Syrian war took off in 2011. So that's 11 years ago. And it has ebbed and flowed, and a lot of it's hidden because a lot of us couldn't get in there when ISIS took over a lot of those, the Islamic State took over a lot of those areas. So there was just a lot less read on what was going on. But Ukraine has been in everyone's face. It happened so suddenly. And I think that those are reasons why we have seen a disparity, but there are a host of reasons. And the questioner is right to raise those questions, absolutely.
And just to quickly add, I think just to pick up on Scott's last point is, I've said this previously, like no one saw this invasion coming except the entire U.S. intelligence apparatus. They prepped the world for the possibility of this invasion. And in fact, the invasion will be televised. We are watching it unfold in real time. And I think that too there is not a blackout as we have seen in so many other countries. We are actually able to watch this happen, and you see the discordance between what you hear from the Kremlin and what the civilians are suffering in Ukraine. And I think that disharmony, that discord is created this outpouring because people can see and hear the suffering, and they respond to that in a visceral way.
Great. Well, thank you. This has been just wonderful. A lot of you probably online don't know this, but we put this event together really quickly. It was something new for us in the sense of trying to respond quickly to what we felt was a need. And so just really grateful for everyone who joined today. And we hope that, whatever drove you to come, whatever that need was, that was in some way fulfilled, and we were able to kind of help you as you're wrestling with these things. And of course, with that, just immense gratitude to Martin and to Scott and Amelia for what they've talked about today, but obviously more than that, the work that they've done. And, with Amelia, the hours that she puts in, the being annoying to your correspondents takes a lot out of your weekend, but, you do it because you love them. And then obviously the enormous dedication that these people have shown, these men have shown to the Monitor and frankly to the world, to try and not only, keep the light on for people seeing what's happening, but also to bring that Monitor perspective there, which in a lot of ways really distinguishes our coverage from what we see in a lot of other places. And Dave, thank you for working through, I'm sure, all those different questions that we got from all of our readers. And we do hope that people did feel like they got some of their questions answered. If not their question directly, hopefully we got ones that answered a lot of different questions at once. Beyond that, please, thanks to all the events team that did put this on so quickly and so beautifully. That was led by promotions and events manager Lauren Crandall, by the producer Lena Carlson, Greg Fitzgerald, who's been great about keeping us on task, Vince Lamascolo, Jen Murphy, Cortland Reetskin, and Paul Woodsum. And the Monitor's product owner is Kim Proctor. We also had terrific support putting this together from our technical team, Ian Blakier, Tim Malone, Alyssa Britton, and Noel Flatt. And we hope you will all participate in the chat session, which will follow. And again, you'll be able to find instructions on screen about that in just a little bit. So just be sure to make sure that you visit csmonitor.com/Ukraine for our coverage, to subscribe to the Christian Science Monitor to help us in supporting us to do this kind of work, and to sign up for our free newsletters to just stay in touch. So thank you again, everyone, for this wonderful event. Really appreciate it. I'm Mark Sabenfield, editor of the Christian Science Monitor. We hope to see you again soon.